There is a photograph taken in 1952 that captures something extraordinary in its absolute ordinariness. A woman sits at a kidney-shaped vanity table in a bedroom in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. She's wearing a quilted housecoat the colour of pale rose. Her hair is already pinned. The clock on the nightstand reads 10 minutes past 9, and on that vanity, arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instrument tray, sits a jar of Pond's cold cream, a folded stack of facial tissues, a bottle of skin tonic, and a small ceramic dish holding a bar of soap she will notably not be using on her face tonight. She is 26 years old. She's been performing this ritual every single night since she was 15 because her mother performed it, and because every advertisement in every women's magazine published in the English-speaking world told her that this was not vanity. This was maintenance. This was the serious, scientific business of keeping one's skin alive. The cold cream ritual of the 1950s was not a casual suggestion. It was a doctrine, and to understand why it held such absolute authority over the nighttime behaviour of millions of American women, you have to understand something fundamental about the skin, about the city, and about the particular anxious energy of a post-war nation that had discovered both prosperity and paranoia at roughly the same moment. The war had ended, the men had come home, the factories that had churned out munitions were now churning out automobiles and appliances and processed food and, critically, industrial smog. American cities in the early 1950s were wrapped in a permanent atmospheric haze. Coal-burning furnaces, automobile exhaust, factory output, and the general combustion of an economy at full throttle had turned the air of cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Los Angeles and New York into something the dermatologists of the era began describing with genuine alarm. The grime was not metaphorical. It was physical and measurable, and it landed on the skin like a fine, invisible soot, clogging pores, dulling complexions, and accelerating the process that women of the era called, in their polite and slightly frightened vocabulary, aging. Cold cream was the answer. It had been the answer in various chemical formulations since the physician Galen of Pergamon mixed beeswax with water and olive oil in the 2nd century, and recorded that the resulting white emulsion disappeared on contact with skin, vanished as if absorbed, leaving the surface cool and clean. Hence the name, cold cream, a cream that cools. The formulation had been refined by pharmacists and beauty entrepreneurs across 18 centuries of cosmetic history, arriving in the American market of the 1950s in its most sophisticated form yet, housed in the wide-mouthed glass jars that sat on vanities from Maine to California. Pond's Extract Company had, by 1950, transformed cold cream from a pharmacy product into a cultural institution. Their advertising, which ran in publications including Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's and Vogue, did not merely sell a product, it narrated a world view. The Pond's advertisement was a masterpiece of aspirational social pressure. It featured real society women, names that appeared in the pages of the social register, women with family connections to ambassadors and industrialists and old money, who were photographed in their drawing rooms and country houses and who testified, with the serene confidence of people who have never in their lives worried about money, that their flawless skin was the result of the Pond's two-cream method. The logic was beautiful in its simplicity. If women with access to every resource and luxury available on the American continent chose Pond's cold cream, then perhaps the cream itself was not a necessity of economics but a choice of refinement, and refinement, in 1952 America, was exactly what every woman in every suburban apartment building and factory town wanted to claim for herself. The two-cream method, which Pons advertised with the fervour of a missionary organisation, was elegantly structured. First came cold cream, applied to the face in generous circles, worked into the pores with the fingertips, allowed to sit for a moment while it dissolved the day's accumulation, the foundation, the face powder, the lipstick residue, the invisible atmospheric grime. Then the cream was removed with tissue, not water, because water, according to the prevailing wisdom of the era, was harsh on the delicate facial membrane and stripped natural oils. After the cream came the second step, Pond's Vanishing Cream, a lighter, non-greasy formulation designed to be absorbed rather than removed, leaving the skin moisturized and prepared for the night's regenerative work. The logic was sound, dermatologically speaking, even if the specific pseudoscience surrounding it, the claims about pores breathing, about cream feeding the skin through absorption, about the vanishing cream creating an invisible protective film, was considerably more theatrical than accurate. But it worked. Or rather, it worked well enough, and it worked in a way that can be precisely described. The mechanical action of massaging a cream into the skin and removing it with tissue genuinely cleansed more thoroughly than soap and water in several respects. It dissolved oil-based makeup and environmental pollutants that a water-based cleanser could not penetrate. It did not disrupt the skin's acid mantle the way alkaline soap did, and the massage action increased circulation to the facial tissues in a way that had measurable aesthetic effects. Women who performed the ritual consistently through their 20s and 30s often did have better skin than women who did not, and this observable fact gave the ritual a credibility that advertising alone could not have manufactured. The competing brand in this market was Woodbury Soap Company, which had pivoted with remarkable commercial agility from its original soap-centered identity to a full skincare line built around cold cream formulations. Where Pons had claimed the society woman, Woodbury had claimed the romantic. Their famous advertising slogan, "A skin you love to touch," was considered scandalously sensual for its era and was credited by marketing historians with transforming the American woman's relationship to skin care from a hygiene discussion to a romantic one. Woodbury understood, perhaps before any other company in the category, that the woman who bought cold cream was not buying cleanliness alone. She was buying the possibility of intimacy. She was buying the right to be touched, appraised, and found adequate by the man who mattered to her. That this framing placed an enormous and unfair weight on the purchase of a $3 jar of cream is a conversation the advertising industry would not begin having for another 20 years. The nightly ritual had a choreography. Women of the era, when interviewed by sociologists conducting domestic life studies in the early 1950s, described their nighttime skincare routines with the matter-of-fact precision of describing a recipe. You cleansed first. You toned with a skin tonic, usually a witch hazel preparation or an astringent from Revlon or Dorothy Gray, applied to a cotton ball and swept across the face in upward motions, because downward motions, it was believed with total conviction and no particular evidence, encouraged sagging. You moisturized. If you had particular concerns, a spot of dryness at the jaw, a tendency toward oiliness at the forehead, you addressed those with targeted preparations, tiny glass bottles of serums that were not yet called serums, because that word was still decades away from its place in the beauty vocabulary, and then you went to sleep because the work of skin renewal happened in the night, when the body was at rest and the skin was supposedly at its most receptive. What is remarkable about the cold cream ritual of the 1950s, viewed from the distance of 70-some years, is not its scientific limitations but its completeness as a cultural practice. It was a ritual that women performed for themselves, in private at the end of the day, in a domestic space over which they had nearly total control. The vanity table was their territory. The jars and bottles arranged upon it were their tools. The 15 or 20 minutes of the nightly routine were time carved out of the domestic schedule. The cooking and cleaning and child-rearing and husband-attending that belonged to no one but them. And this, perhaps more than any advertising campaign or dermatological recommendation, explains the tenacity with which the ritual persisted across generations. The cold cream jar was passed down like an inheritance. Daughters watched mothers, granddaughters watched grandmothers. The specific brand might change, from Pond's to Noxema to Jergens to the newer, more expensive formulations emerging from the laboratories of Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein. But the fundamental gesture, the nightly turning toward the vanity mirror, the opening of the jar, the first cool touch of cream on the skin, was constant across class lines and geographic divides in a way that few beauty practices have managed to be before or since. Today, the 10-step skincare routines of the 21st century, the serums and essences and sheet masks and active ingredients at concentrations that would have seemed indistinguishable from medicine to a woman of 1952, are direct descendants of that original doctrine. Cleanse thoroughly, moisturize consistently, make the ritual a fixed point in the day rather than a response to crisis. The cold cream revolution did not end. It expanded. The jar on the vanity became the cabinet of products, the bathroom shelf that groans with specialized treatments for specialized concerns. But somewhere underneath the retinol and the hyaluronic acid and the chemical exfoliants, the original gesture persists. A woman at the end of her day, touching her own face, performing the small and serious act of care. The chemistry behind the cold cream's action on the skin was, by the 1950s, beginning to be understood with greater precision than at any previous point in the product's long history. Dermatologists working in American universities and in the research departments of the major cosmetic companies were conducting studies of skin physiology that would eventually, over the following decades, produce a genuinely scientific framework for understanding what cleansing products did and did not do to the integumentary system. The stratum corneum, the outermost layer of the skin, composed of flattened, protein-rich, dead cells embedded in a lipid matrix that functioned as both barrier and waterproofing, was the primary subject of this research, and the findings consistently indicated that this layer was simultaneously more resilient and more complex than the beauty industry's advertising had suggested. The lipid matrix of the stratum corneum was, among other things, an excellent solvent for oil-based substances, which is precisely why oil-based cleansers like cold cream were more effective at removing oil-based makeup and sebum than water-based formulations. The alkaline pH of soap, which was typically in the range of 9 to 10, disrupted the acid mantle. The slightly acidic surface film created by the combined secretions of the skin's sweat and sebaceous glands, and this disruption could be felt by sensitive skin as a tightness or dryness that persisted for hours after washing. Cold cream, with its oil-continuous phase and its neutral to slightly acidic pH, did not produce this disruption, which was one of the reasons that women with drier or more sensitive skin found it genuinely preferable as a cleanser. The skin tonic that followed the cold cream in the standard ritual served multiple functions, some of them genuinely cosmetic and some of them largely psychological. Witch hazel, the most common ingredient in the drugstore-priced tonics, had genuine astringent properties, It caused mild, temporary contraction of the skin's surface vessels, and its cooling sensation was pleasant and felt cleansing in a way that reinforced the sense of completion. The more expensive tonics from brands like Dorothy Gray or Helena Rubinstein used different formulations, often incorporating rosewater, glycerin, and various botanical extracts, whose efficacy was less well established, but whose fragrance and texture made the application a sensory pleasure, distinct from the purely functional. The tonic was also the moment of the ritual that most resembled a medical procedure in its action. The cotton ball, the sweeping motion. The brief examination of the cotton surface to see what it had removed. And this quasi-medical quality was not accidental. The beauty industry of the 1950s understood that its products were competing in the consumer's psychological economy, not only with other beauty products, but with the authority of medicine and the incorporation of clinical or procedural elements into the cosmetic ritual borrowed some of that authority. The vanity table itself deserves recognition as a piece of functional architecture that organized and enabled the ritual it supported. The kidney-shaped table, its curved form designed so that the seated woman was surrounded by surface on three sides, maximizing the usable space within arm's reach, was a post-war furniture form that appeared in bedrooms throughout the 1950s, in a range of materials from painted wood to mirrored glass to the blonde maple that was the decade's preferred veneer. The triptych mirror that sat upon it, 3 panels, the central one fixed, the 2 side panels hinged at angles that could be adjusted, allowed a woman to see her face from multiple directions simultaneously, enabling the kind of comprehensive examination that a single flat mirror could not provide. The lighting, ideally from bulbs arranged around the mirror's perimeter rather than positioned above, eliminated the downward shadows that made makeup application difficult. In the arrangement of objects on the vanity surface, as in so many other aspects of 1950s domestic life, there was an aesthetic standard that was also a practical one. Things were arranged by order of use, which typically corresponded to a left-to-right progression that mirrored the reading direction of the literate Western woman, and the arrangement was kept orderly not only because orderliness was a social virtue, but because a disordered vanity made the ritual slower and more frustrating, and the nightly ritual was something that most women of the era performed at the end of full days that had left them genuinely tired. Efficiency was embedded in elegance, and the two were, at the vanity table of the 1950s, barely distinguishable. In the spring of 1954, a memo circulated through the makeup department of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer that detailed, with the dry precision of a technical manual, the exact specifications required to transform a human face into a face legible to Technicolor film stock. The foundation had to be mixed to a shade slightly warmer than the actress's natural skin tone because the camera cooled everything it captured. The eyeshadow had to be applied in layers dense enough to register through studio lighting that burned with the intensity of industrial arc welders. The lips had to be outlined in a pigment darker than the lipstick itself, because the camera flattened dimension and only strong geometry survived the translation from 3-dimensional face to 2-dimensional screen. The memo was not unusual. Variations of it had been circulating through Hollywood studios since the talkies, when the addition of sound to cinema had forced the studios to rethink the relationship between a human face and the apparatus recording it. What made the 1950s different from every previous decade in Hollywood's relationship with beauty was the convergence of two forces simultaneously. Technicolor had become dominant, replacing the flat black and white palette that had governed screen aesthetics since the 1920s, and a new generation of female stars had arrived whose physical and cultural presence was so distinct, so philosophically opposed to one another, that their faces became shorthand for two entirely different versions of what American womanhood could be. On one side was Grace Kelly, on the other was Marilyn Monroe, and the makeup chairs of Hollywood studios, presided over by department heads whose craft was as precise as any industrial specification, spent the decade constructing and maintaining the visual grammar of this opposition. Grace Kelly arrived at Paramount in 1951 already knowing what she was. She'd been raised in a wealthy Philadelphia family with the cultural DNA of the American aristocracy, not the inherited European kind, but the harder, newer American version built on achievement and correct behavior, and the absolute composure that comes from never having needed to perform desperation. Her face was a sculptor's challenge, extraordinarily beautiful in its geometry, with high pronounced cheekbones, a perfectly proportioned nose, and eyes of an unusual blue-grey that photographed with startling clarity. The Paramount makeup team, led by the department chief Wally Westmore, made a decision about Kelly that was, for Hollywood, almost radical. They minimized. Foundation sheerer than the MGM specification. Eye makeup precise and contained. Lips in corals and soft roses rather than the heavy reds that dominated the decade. The effect was of a woman who had arrived at her own presentation fully formed, who required no theatrical amplification. The message her face sent, and it was a message as deliberately constructed as any advertisement, was one of self-possession. You did not look at Grace Kelly and wonder what she wanted. She had already decided. Marilyn Monroe's relationship with the makeup chair was a different thing entirely, and the women who sat in these chairs in the 1950s understood this with the clarity of craft. Monroe had extraordinary raw material. Her skin was luminous to a degree that Technicolor registered almost ecstatically, her hair bleached to a near-white blonde that the camera loved. But her beauty was a thing that required active assembly, and she knew it and participated in that assembly with a combination of anxiety and intelligence that her publicists preferred to conceal. The Monroe aesthetic was built on softness and maximalism simultaneously. Foundation blended in multiple shades to create artificial dimensionality where the camera would flatten it. A matte powder that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating the effect of skin luminous from within rather than lit from without. Eyes lined in a very specific technique that pulled the outer corner down slightly rather than up, so that the gaze appeared perpetually vulnerable rather than triumphant. The lips were the most studied element. Monroe's mouth was the subject of more column inches in beauty publications of the 1950s than perhaps any other single feature of any other single human face. The technique involved multiple steps, a foundation base to neutralize the natural lip color, a dark liner applied just outside the natural lip line to increase perceived fullness, a fill of the decade's most saturated red, and a final touch of pale gloss applied precisely to the center of the upper lip to create the impression of a dimensional pout. These two archetypes, the Kelly composure and the Monroe vulnerability, were not merely aesthetic preferences. They were philosophical positions about what beauty was for, what it communicated, and who it was directed toward. Kelly's beauty operated as a kind of declaration of self-sufficiency. It said, "I am this, and this is sufficient, and the looking is your privilege." Monroe's beauty operated as an invitation, a question, a reaching toward. The tragedy, which would not become fully legible until Monroe's death in 1962, was that the reaching was genuine and not merely performed, and that neither Hollywood nor American culture had any framework for receiving that genuine quality with the seriousness it deserved. The women watching from theatre seats in the suburban cinemas of the 1950s were doing something more complex than entertainment consumption. They were conducting a continuous negotiation with these archetypes, measuring themselves against and through these faces, borrowing elements of each aesthetic and translating them into the vocabularies of their own daily lives with the available tools. The drugstore foundation, the department store lipstick, the small kit of implements arranged on the bathroom counter between the ivory soap and the husband's shaving brush. A secretary in Des Moines could not replicate the specific coral of Grace Kelly's lips, but she could borrow the restraint. A factory worker in Detroit could not achieve the Monroe foundation technique without professional instruction, but she could understand and attempt the principle that beauty, at its most powerful, was not about concealment, but about presentation, not about hiding imperfection, but about constructing a face that made an argument about who you were and what you deserved. The studio makeup chairs themselves were remarkable spaces. Located deep in the makeup building of each major studio, MGM had an entire department dedicated to the purpose, with rows of chairs facing mirrors framed by theatrical bulbs. They were sites of extraordinary craft knowledge held in the hands of men and women who had spent careers studying the specific properties of colour, light, and the human face. The department heads, Westmore at Paramount, William Tuttle at MGM, Ben Lane at 20th Century Fox, were not merely technicians. They were artists working in the medium of the human face, and they held their knowledge closely, passing it to assistants through apprenticeship rather than any formal document. The formulations they developed, the specific grease paint mixtures, the powder weights, the lip colour combinations that survived screen translation, were proprietary in the most literal sense. They lived in their hands. The public performance aspect of the Hollywood makeup aesthetic extended beyond the film itself. Actresses of the 1950s were expected to be complete at every public moment, which meant that the face presented at premieres, press events, department store appearances, and charity functions had to be identical to the face on screen. This was not vanity. This was industrial specification. The fan who waited outside the Grauman's Chinese Theatre to glimpse Grace Kelly at a premiere was comparing the screen image to the physical presence, and any discrepancy, any visible evidence of humanness, of improvisation, of the gap between the constructed face and the face beneath, was experienced as a kind of betrayal. The contract between star and audience required the fiction to be sustained. What these women were performing, in their chairs and on their screens and in their public appearances, was something that the cultural scholar Irving Goffman would begin theorizing in 1959, just as the decade was closing. The presentation of self as a continuous, active and skilled performance, a management of impressions that required discipline and preparation, and a precise understanding of what the audience expected to see. The Hollywood studio simply made this universal human activity visible and exaggerated and profitable. Today, the archetypes Kelly and Monroe established have proven themselves almost indestructible. The blonde maximalist versus the cool blonde minimalist, the warmth versus the reserve, the reaching versus the withholding. These polarities turn up in every decade's celebrity culture, renamed and restyled but structurally identical. What has changed is the understanding of who pays the cost of the performance. The women in the 1950s makeup chairs were performing for an industry and a culture that extracted enormous labour from that performance, while insisting, in its advertising and its fan magazines and its gossip columns, that the beauty was effortless. the seams, the chair, the mixing bowl, the specific technique, these were invisible by design. It is the vanishing of that labour, not the beauty itself, that we are still in the process of making visible. The question of authenticity that haunted the performance of beauty in the 1950s, the persistent anxiety about whether the constructed face was, in some meaningful sense, a truth or a deception, was articulated most explicitly not in the cultural commentary of the period, but in the advice columns and the women's magazine features that addressed beauty most directly. The distinction that these publications consistently drew was between beauty that enhanced and beauty that masked, between the use of cosmetics to present the best version of an existing face and the use of cosmetics to construct a face that bore no relationship to the underlying reality. The former was universally endorsed. The latter was described in terms of moral concern that would seem extreme by contemporary standards. The specific anxiety about the relationship between the constructed face and the authentic self was sharpest at the junction point of the two dominant archetypes. Kelly and Monroe represented not only two different aesthetics, but two different theories of what beauty was for. Kelly's aesthetic argued that beauty was the revelation of inherent quality, that the face underneath the careful, minimal makeup was worthy of presentation and required only gentle amplification. Monroe's aesthetic argued something more complicated, that beauty was a collaborative creation between the raw material of the face and the skilled application of technique, and that the result of this collaboration could be more real, more truly communicative of the inner person than the unmade face ever managed. Both positions are recognizable as theories of art. One is classical, one is romantic. Both have adherents who are not discussing cosmetics at all. The studio photographs of the era, the publicity stills, the magazine covers, the fan magazine portraits, were themselves a technology of constructed reality that the viewing public understood perfectly well to be constructed and chose to receive as truth anyway, because the truth being constructed was aspirational rather than documentary. The Richard Avedon photograph of Audrey Hepburn for Harper's Bazaar in 1954 was not a document of how Hepburn appeared when she walked down the street unlit and unretouched. It was a proposition about what a face could communicate when everything available to light, composition, expertise, and post-production was deployed in its service. The viewer of that photograph understood this implicitly and was moved by it anyway, because the proposition itself was meaningful, because the aspiration it embodied was real even if the image was constructed. The makeup artists who presided over the studio chairs were in this sense theorists as much as technicians. Their daily work was the translation of ideas about femininity, beauty, and aspiration into physical configurations of pigment and powder on the faces of women who were themselves performing those ideas through the additional medium of acting. The layering of performance was characteristic of the era, the actress performing a character, the makeup performing a version of the actress, the publicity performing a version of the makeup, and the audience receiving all of these performances simultaneously as a coherent and moving experience. That this experience was essentially always moving, that it worked, that the constructed faces of the 1950s Hollywood machine produced emotions in their viewers that were genuine and lasting, suggests that the construction was not in opposition to the truth, but was, in the particular way of all skilled art making, in service of it. The connection between the Hollywood aesthetic and the daily practice of ordinary American women was maintained through a distribution network of beauty products that was itself a kind of technology of aspiration. Max Factor's line of cosmetics, originally developed for film production, was marketed to the general consumer market with the explicit claim that these were the products used by the stars of the screen. Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein both maintained studios in Hollywood that served the film industry, and both used the resulting celebrity connections as advertising capital. The ordinary woman buying a Max Factor pressed powder at a Los Angeles drugstore was purchasing, in the most literal sense available to her, proximity to the faces that moved her on the screen. The product was the same product. The gap between the screen face and the bathroom mirror face remained, but the bridge had been built, and women crossed it willingly every morning. In the winter of 1953, a chemist working in the Revlon Research Laboratory in New York developed a formula that would change the geometry of the American female face. It was an ink-based liquid eyeliner, not the first such product, but the first formulated with a pigment concentration dense enough to produce a truly opaque line in a single stroke, and with a vehicle that dried fast enough to allow the precise thin extension at the outer corner of the eye that the makeup artists of Hollywood had been achieving with theatrical grease paint and pointed brushes for nearly 20 years, but which no commercially available product had yet made accessible to the woman applying her own face at a bathroom mirror in the early morning. The doe eye that resulted from this technology was not a casual aesthetic preference. It was a statement about seeing and being seen, about the social function of the gaze in a culture that placed extraordinary pressure on women to be visually legible, to signal through the arrangement of their features their status, their availability, their values, and their level of investment in the ongoing performance of femininity. The extended line at the outer corner of the eye, the flick, the wing, the cat-eye line, it would be called by different names in different contexts, did something very specific to the female face. It widened the apparent aperture of the eye. It created a horizontal extension that drew the viewer's gaze outward and upward, altering the apparent dimensions of the orbital area and giving the face a quality that beauty writers of the era consistently described with the same vocabulary: wakefulness, expressiveness, and a slightly startled openness that was coded in the aesthetics of the decade as both feminine and alluring. The technique was enormously difficult to execute. This is a fact that the era's advertising carefully elided, because the social compact of the 1950s demanded that feminine beauty appear effortless even when it was not, and the instruction copy in beauty magazines of the period described the application of liquid liner with a serene casualness that bore essentially no relationship to what a woman actually experienced attempting it at 7 a.m. before work. The liner had to be applied in a single, confident stroke, because hesitation produced a wobbly, fractured line that could not be corrected without removing the entire eye makeup and starting again. The angle of the wing had to be calibrated to the specific shape of the individual eye. An angle that was appropriate for a wide-set eye would look wrong on a close-set one. A wing pitched too high would create a theatrical effect appropriate to evening but bizarre at a desk, and the precise thickness of the line at the lid versus the taper at the wing required a spatial intelligence and a steadiness of hand that was, genuinely, a skill that had to be learned and practiced. The women who mastered it were known for it. This was not a casual achievement. A woman in the 1950s who could reliably apply a perfect liquid liner wing was known in her office and her social circle for this ability, the way a woman today might be known for a particular professional skill. The vocabulary of the era, the phrase, "she always looks so put together," encoded, among other things, the technical proficiency of the makeup application, and the liner was the hardest element, the most visible evidence of either mastery or its absence. The brushes used for the application were themselves a technical challenge, The liner applicants of the early 1950s were wand-style tools, a glass or metal tube containing the ink-based formula, with a pointed applicator at the tip. The earliest versions were difficult to control for two reasons. The applicator was often too flexible, bending under the slight pressure of application and producing a line of variable thickness, and the ink formula was prone to dripping at the tip if the wand was inverted for too long during the mixing or shaking that the formula required before each use. By the mid-1950s, Revlon and the competing brand Hazel Bishop, whose liquid liner formulations were considered by many professional makeup artists to be superior for precision work, had refined both the formula and the applicator, producing a product that was still demanding but measurably more controllable than its predecessors. The social context of the liner was specific. The 1950s eye was not the 1960s eye that would follow it. The decade that came next would take the liquid liner concept and extend it to an almost abstract geometry. The wide, flat graphic eyes of the mod aesthetic, the theatrical severity of the Twiggy look. The 1950s eye was rounder, softer in its overall impression, even when the liner itself was precise and geometric. The combination was achieved through the counterbalancing of the hard line with extremely soft handling of the lid colour itself, typically a very pale shade, cream or shell or the faintest possible pink, applied over the entire lid to create a reflective brightness, and with heavy mascara applied to lashes that were, in the beauty vocabulary of the era, supposed to be as full and separated as possible, without achieving the clearly artificial quality that was considered appropriate only for evening. The mascara technology of the 1950s deserves its own consideration. The dominant product was a cake mascara, a pressed block of black or dark brown pigment that required moistening with water or saliva, the latter being, famously, the preferred application method of professionals because it produced a smoother, more controllable consistency than water, and was then applied with a small, stiff-bristled brush in multiple coats. Between each coat, the lashes had to be separated with a safety pin, a hairpin, or a specialized metal lash comb, because the product was dense enough to stick lashes together into clumps, and a clumped lash was, in the aesthetic judgment of the era, a failure roughly equivalent to a smeared liner. The mascara wand tube with its integrated spiral brush, the format we now consider standard, would not arrive in its modern form until the mid-1960s, meaning that the whole elaborate mascara ritual of the 1950s was built around products and tools that demanded considerably more time and technical knowledge than their successors. Max Factor, the makeup brand whose founder had pioneered the study of film-appropriate cosmetics in the 1910s and 20s, was the dominant force in mascara through the 1950s. Their eyelash beautifier was the product that established the category's commercial template in the American drugstore market, and their advertising, which featured close-up photography of eyes that had clearly been worked on by professional makeup artists, created the aspirational standard against which every woman measured her own morning results. The gap between the advertising eye and the bathroom mirror eye was, in most cases, enormous. This gap was not acknowledged in the advertising, of course. It was part of the silent contract between the beauty industry and its customers. The image presents the ideal, the customer supplies the aspiration, and neither party formally acknowledges that the ideal is the product of professional application under studio lighting, documented by a professional photographer, and then retouched before publication. The eyebrow sat above and shaped the whole performance of the 1950s eye, and its management was nearly as labour-intensive as the liner itself. The decade's eyebrow was a specific shape, a relatively thin, dramatically arched line that reached its apex at roughly the outer edge of the iris, and then descended at a steep angle toward the temple. This shape was achieved through a combination of tweezing, which removed hairs from below the brow to define the lower edge and from the inner and outer corners to establish the arch, and penciling, which filled in the remaining hairs with a hard wax pencil in a colour slightly darker than the natural brow, and drew in the arch trajectory the tweezers had established. The result at its best was a brow that appeared to express perpetual, pleasant interest. A slight raising of the outer corners that widened the eye and gave the face an expression of attentive engagement. What the winged liner, the pale lid, the separated lash, and the arched brow produced together was a very specific visual argument about the eyes, and, by extension, about the woman wearing them. The doe eye of the 1950s was not a passive aesthetic. Despite its associated vocabulary of softness and femininity, it was a technically demanding, labour-intensive construction that required daily commitment and genuine skill to execute. The woman who wore it well was performing a kind of visual eloquence, a mastery of a medium as complex in its way as any other. That this mastery was simultaneously devalued, classified as vanity, as feminine preoccupation, as something trivially unlike the serious pursuits reserved for men, is one of the decade's characteristic ironies, that the most technically demanding form of daily performance was classified as no work at all. The legacy of the 1950s eye shape is visible in every decade that has followed it. The wing comes back on a roughly 10-year cycle, reinterpreted in each era's aesthetic vocabulary, sharper in the 60s, more smudged in the 70s, power-lined in the 80s, deconstructed in the 90s, and then returned in the 2000s in a form the 1950s woman would have recognized almost instantly. The geometry is unkillable because it answers something that does not change: the human desire to make the eye more present, more open, more immediately communicative, more insistently there. The colour of the 1950s eyeshadow was itself a social code, whose vocabulary has largely been lost in subsequent decades, but which was, to women of the era, as readable as typography. The pale, frosted shades that dominated daytime eye makeup, ivory, shell, the faintest imaginable pink or blue, occasionally a very pale green, were understood to be appropriate across a range of contexts from professional to social, because their optical effect was to brighten without calling attention to themselves. They reflected light upward onto the eye without depositing visible colour, and the impression they created was of natural vividness rather than cosmetic application. The woman who wore them well had achieved what the beauty vocabulary of the decade called a natural look, a phrase that was, even then, recognised as somewhat paradoxical, since the look in question required a moisturiser, a foundation, a powder, a pale lid colour, a liner, mascara, an arched and filled brow, and at minimum 2 lipstick steps to achieve. The evening eye was a different proposition entirely. For cocktail parties, theatre attendance, dinner parties, and any other occasion that the social calendar of the 1950s classified as after 6, the eye makeup could expand in both colour saturation and application technique in ways that were explicitly inappropriate before that hour. The deeper shadow colours, the mauves and plums and deep greens and even the occasional gold, came out in the evening along with the heavier liner application that the stronger lighting of evening venues required to maintain the day's precision. The switch from the pale day eye to the more dramatic evening eye was performed in the ladies' room of the restaurant or club where the transition occurred, in the 20 minutes between office and cocktail hour, with the compact mirror, the lipstick, and the small secondary liner pencil or shadow pot that every woman of the era carried in her evening bag specifically for this purpose. The technology of false eyelashes occupied a peculiar position in the beauty culture of the decade. False lashes had been available as a theatrical and specialty product for decades. Max Factor had supplied them to the film industry from the 1910s, but by the 1950s they were beginning to make their way into the consumer market as a product appropriate for the most extreme evening glamour. The individual false lash, a single hair, or a cluster of 2 or 3 adhered to the natural lash with a surgical adhesive, was more wearable than the full strip lash, which required a precision of application that was genuinely difficult to achieve without professional assistance. And the individual approach was sometimes used by skilled amateur makeup artists to add density at the outer corners without the artificiality of the full strip. The full strip itself was classified firmly as theatrical or evening formal territory, appropriate for a formal reception or a charity gala, completely outside the bounds of ordinary daytime wear and understood by anyone who observed it in daylight as a clear signal that the wearer had either not removed her makeup from the previous night or had misjudged her occasion. The maintenance of the finished eye throughout a working day or a social evening involved a kind of ongoing vigilance that became automatic through practice. A smudge of mascara beneath the lower lid, the raccoon eye effect that resulted from the formula's tendency to transfer to the under-eye skin over the course of a humid or warm day, required immediate attention and discreet correction, accomplished with a fingertip or a cotton-wrapped hairpin, applied precisely to the smudge without disturbing the surrounding foundation. A liner that had migrated from the lid edge into the crease needed a similar targeted correction. The woman who maintained her eye makeup through a full day without visible deterioration was acknowledged in the beauty culture of the era to have achieved something. The correct product, certainly, but also the knowledge of her own particular chemistry and the habituated attention to the small maintenance that kept the finished look intact. This combination of product knowledge and self-knowledge was, in the domestic science vocabulary of the era, exactly what was meant by the phrase, knowing how to take care of yourself. There exists in the archives of the Ladies' Home Journal for May 1954 a 2-page spread with the headline, Elegant Slimming Menus for the Modern Hostess, that may represent the most concentrated catalogue of nutritional absurdity ever assembled between 2 pages of a major American publication. The menus it proposed for a week of gracious, calorie-conscious entertaining included a dinner built around a ring mould of lime gelatin filled with cream cheese and canned pear halves, served alongside a tomato stuffed with tuna salad bound with precisely measured mayonnaise. A lunch featured cottage cheese on a bed of iceberg lettuce, accompanied by 3 Melba toast crackers and a measured portion of grapefruit juice. The entire week's menu totaled, according to the magazine's own careful calorie counts, considerably less than modern nutrition science would consider adequate for an adult woman performing ordinary daily activities. But the menus were not eccentric. They were entirely representative of the dominant approach to weight management in the 1950s, which was built on a set of nutritional assumptions that seem, from the perspective of contemporary science, both mistaken and revealing. Mistaken because the calorie restriction models they employed were extreme enough to produce the metabolic effects that nutritionists of the 21st century would recognize as starvation adaptation, the slowed metabolism, the eventual weight regain, the cycling between restriction and compensatory eating that we now understand as the predictable physiological response to severe caloric deficit. Revealing because the specific foods that 1950s diet culture selected as permissible, gelatin, cottage cheese, iceberg lettuce, canned vegetables, measured portions of lean protein, illuminate with extraordinary precision the aesthetic and social assumptions of the era about what thin bodies meant and what they cost. The gelatin mold is the central artifact of 1950s diet culture, and it deserves examination as both food and symbol. Gelatin, as a protein, had been available in American homes since the late 19th century, but it was the development of flavoured, coloured, prepackaged gelatin mixes. Knox gelatin had dominated the unflavoured market for decades, but it was Jell-O, owned by General Foods, that transformed the substance into a cultural institution that elevated it to the central ingredient of 1950s domestic cooking. The appeal of gelatin to the diet-conscious cook of the era was multiple and mutually reinforcing. It was low in calories when made with water rather than cream or juice. It could be moulded into elaborate, visually impressive forms that satisfied the era's intense aesthetic investment in the presentation of food. It could incorporate, and here the word incorporate should be savoured for its accuracy, virtually any other food item: fruit, vegetables, protein, even more improbably, savoury ingredients like olives and onion rings and canned asparagus that created what one 1953 cookbook called the suspended salad, a concept whose name alone is a kind of accidental poetry. The companies that produced gelatin were aggressive and creative marketers who understood that the post-war housewife was simultaneously anxious about her figure, anxious about her reputation as a hostess, and anxious about the impression her table made on the guests and the husband who sat around it. Knox and Jell-O both produced recipe booklets distributed through grocery stores that proposed gelatin as the solution to all three anxieties simultaneously, a dish that was elegant in its moulded precision, impressive in the time it appeared to require, and, critically, compatible with the calorie budgets that magazine diet columns had convinced millions of women to track. The Knox booklet of 1951, whose cover featured an elaborately towering ring mould surrounded by stylized illustrations of elegant women, proposed gelatin as the basis for appetizers, main courses, side dishes, and desserts, with a thoroughness that suggested the company's R&D department had considered whether gelatin could be used in the preparation of coffee, and had decided against it only on grounds of texture. The tomato and egg yolk menu mentioned in the Ladies' Home Journal was part of a specific diet regimen that circulated through the 1950s under various names: the Hollywood diet, the grapefruit diet, the egg and citrus plan, that were united by certain common principles despite their surface differences. They relied on the popular belief, which had no firm scientific basis but was repeated often enough to achieve the status of received truth, that certain foods had specific metabolic effects beyond their caloric content, that grapefruit contained an enzyme that accelerated fat burning, that eggs provided a protein that was uniquely muscle-preserving during weight loss, that tomato juice had a diuretic and detoxifying effect. These beliefs were not entirely fabricated. Grapefruit does contain compounds with mild metabolic effects, and the thermic effect of protein does provide a slight advantage during caloric restriction. But their importance was so grossly exaggerated by the diet culture of the era as to be functionally misleading. The high society calorie counting manuals that appeared from publishers, including Doubleday and Simon & Schuster, through the 1950s, represented a more sophisticated, if not necessarily more accurate, approach to the weight management question. These books, works with titles such as Calories Don't Count, which was actually published in 1961 but had enormous cultural roots in the late 50s diet culture, or The Thin Book for the Plump Woman, which exactly as much lived up to its title as you would imagine, addressed themselves to a specific readership. the educated, middle-class woman who considered herself too intelligent to follow a simple restriction diet, but who nevertheless wanted to manage her weight and required the apparatus of system and instruction to do so comfortably. What these books understood, and what made them commercially successful, was that the 1950s woman was not afraid of discipline. She'd grown up through the Depression, been formed in the scarcity culture of the war, and emerged into prosperity with a deeply ingrained belief that virtuous behavior and self-control were identical. A diet that told her to eat less of everything was not a diet she needed to purchase a book to understand. A diet that told her to eat specific things in specific combinations, to understand the metabolic mechanism behind each choice, to participate in the management of her own body as an informed collaborator rather than a passive subject of restriction. This was a diet that felt to the educated woman of the 1950s like intelligence rather than deprivation. The body itself was understood in the era's popular medical culture through a set of frameworks that feel alien to contemporary sensibility. The 1950s woman was instructed to think of her weight in terms of her type, the endomorph, the ectomorph, the mesomorph, a classification system borrowed from the work of the psychologist William Sheldon that was enormously popular in the 1940s and 50s and has since been thoroughly discredited, both scientifically and ethically. The idea that body shape was constitutionally determined, that you were by fundamental biological nature the type that tended toward roundness or the type that tended toward angularity, had the consolatory function of providing a framework within which failure to achieve idealized thinness could be classified as physiological rather than moral. The mesomorph simply could not be expected to achieve the sylph silhouette that the ectomorph wore effortlessly. But this consolation was limited, because the advertising and fashion industries of the era presented an idealized silhouette that was, in fact, quite specific and quite thin, and that was framed not as a constitutional type but as a general achievable ideal. The girdle enters the story here, and its relationship to the diet culture of the 1950s is more intimate than it first appears. The foundation garment industry, dominated by companies including Playtex, which had pioneered the use of latex in foundation wear, and Warner's, whose Little Godiva and Merry Widow designs became category-defining products, was in dialogue with the diet industry in the 1950s in a way that reveals a sophisticated understanding of the consumer's actual situation. Women's magazines routinely published articles about weight management, alongside advertisements for foundation garments that promised to achieve, through structural compression, the silhouette that caloric management was supposed to produce through biological change. The message was consistent. The ideal body was the hourglass body, defined by a small waist and rounded hips, and a specific proportion at the bust. The means of achieving it were to change the body or change the perception of it. What connects the gelatin molds, the tomato and egg yolk menus, the calorie counting manuals and the foundation garments is not a coherent nutritional philosophy, but a cultural anxiety about the female body and its place in the social landscape of the 1950s. Thinness in the era was not merely a health preference, it was a social credential, a signal of self-discipline and domesticity, and the particular kind of deferred gratification that the era's moral framework considered virtuous. The woman who was not thin was, by the implicit logic of the era's diet culture, a woman who had not tried hard enough, who had not applied sufficient will to the management of her own flesh, who had, in the most intimate possible way, fallen short. This framework placed an enormous and corrosive weight on ordinary biological diversity, and the women who internalized it which was most of the women who read the magazines and bought the books and mixed the gelatin and counted the calories, carried it in ways that are still, 2 generations later, in the process of being examined and named. The popular press of the 1950s was an active and often irresponsible participant in the era's diet culture, not merely reflecting the anxiety about female body weight, but actively generating and intensifying it through the content choices it made and the advertising it accepted. Women's magazines, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Ladies' Home Journal, Woman's Day, and the newer entries like Better Homes and Gardens, which was expanding its editorial scope to include beauty and health alongside its core domestic content, published weight loss and diet articles with a frequency that, when examined across the decades' run of issues, amounts to an almost continuous drumbeat of concern about female body weight. The articles appeared in the same issues as recipes for butter-rich desserts and elaborate party foods, creating a content contradiction that the publications navigated through the implicit suggestion that the discipline of the diet and the pleasure of the dessert were both appropriate expressions of the good homemaker's management of her domestic responsibility, one for herself, one for her family. The physician's role in mid-century weight management was not always beneficial. The medical profession of the 1950s operated with considerably more confidence about dietary interventions than the available evidence warranted, and the prescriptive advice that women receive from their doctors about weight management range from sound, reduce caloric intake, increase physical activity, to actively harmful, amphetamine-based diet pills, which suppressed appetite through stimulation of the central nervous system, were prescribed by physicians through the 1950s and 60s with a casualness that would be unrecognizable to contemporary medical practice, and their use was widespread enough to influence the weight management patterns of a significant proportion of the women who participated in the diet culture of the period. The energy and alertness that amphetamines produced were understood by many prescribing physicians as additional benefits rather than side effects, and the pills were marketed under brand names including Dexedrine and Benzedrine, with the bland commercial confidence of an era that had not yet developed the medical and regulatory framework for understanding stimulant dependency. The specific foods that the 1950s classified as slimming versus fattening were not entirely arbitrary, even though the metabolic theories behind the classifications were often wrong. The emphasis on protein, eggs, lean meat, cottage cheese, canned tuna, reflected a genuine understanding that protein was more satiating than carbohydrate at comparable caloric loads, though the mechanisms behind this satiety effect were not yet understood. The de-emphasis of bread, potatoes, and starchy vegetables reflected a real, if exaggerated, observation about the caloric density of these foods relative to their satiety effect. The faith in grapefruit and tomato juice was more problematic, but the produce emphasis at least had the effect of increasing the dietary fiber intake of women who followed these recommendations, which had genuine, if not precisely understood, health benefits. The social performance of restraint at table was itself a significant element of the diet culture's integration into the broader social behavior of the era. A woman who was understood to be watching her figure, a phrase that implies the kind of constant vigilant attention that dieting actually required, was expected to demonstrate this watching at social occasions through visible restraint in her eating, accepting small portions, declining seconds, and occasionally commenting on the exceptional quality of what was being served as a way of signaling appreciation without consumption. This performance of restraint was itself a social credential. It communicated discipline, self-awareness, and the kind of deferred gratification that the era's moral framework endorsed. A woman who ate freely and with visible pleasure was, in the implicit scoring system of mid-century social performance, taking a risk that the woman exercising visible restraint was not. The long aftermath of the 1950s diet culture is now traceable through the research of eating disorder specialists and health psychologists who have documented the transmission of disordered eating patterns across generations. The daughters of the women who dieted strenuously through the 1950s grew up in households where food restriction was normal, where the body was an ongoing project requiring constant management, and where the line between healthy self-care and punishing restriction was unclear. The granddaughters of those women are still navigating the same territory, equipped now with a vocabulary, intuitive eating, body neutrality, anti-diet culture, that their grandmothers did not have, but grappling with impulses that were formed in the same suburban kitchens where the gelatin moulds were mixed, and the calorie counts were tallied in the back pages of the notebook that also held the grocery list. By 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening in 1955, the sound of metal clips opening and closing had begun, like a kind of domestic percussion in houses from Pasadena to Providence. The setting lotion was already on, a thin, slightly sticky liquid applied to damp hair from a bottle of Lilt or Tony or Alberto V05, which smelled of something between chemistry and gardenias, and which, when it dried, would hold the carved sections of hair in exactly the shape they were placed, freezing them through the night into the architecture that, 8 to 10 hours later, would be brushed and teased and finally arranged into the soft, bounced, apparently effortless waves that constituted the most desired hairstyle of the decade. The pin curl set was not a Saturday night ritual because Saturday was significant in any symbolic way. It was a Saturday ritual because Sunday was for church and for being seen, and the set needed a full night to dry completely, and this particular calculus of social appearance and hair chemistry had organized the Saturday evenings of American women for a generation. The technology of the pin curl was older than the 1950s by several decades, but the decade was its fullest expression and its most widespread application, the moment when every woman in the country, regardless of class or geography, had access to the tools and the technique and the social instruction necessary to perform the ritual herself, at home, without professional assistance. The democratization of the salon-quality hairstyle was one of the defining aesthetic achievements of the post-war period, and it happened through the convergence of several forces. The home permanent wave solution, which restructured hair chemically and allowed even straight hair to hold the curl necessary for the set. The bobby pin and metal clip, mass-manufactured to a price point that made them available in every five-and-dime store in the country. And the setting lotion, whose proliferating brands and formulations competed fiercely for the loyalty of a consumer base that understood, through painful experience, that the wrong product produced a stiff, flaking result entirely unlike the supple wave the packaging had promised. The physics of the pin curl are elegant. A wet strand of hair, wound around a cylindrical form, a finger, a roller, or simply rolled upon itself and secured flat to the head, will, as it dries, retain the shape of that cylinder. The hydrogen bonds between the hair's protein chains, broken by the water, reform in the new curved configuration as the water evaporates. The setting lotion reinforced this process by depositing a film of polyvinyl pyrrolidone or similar polymer on each hair shaft that added mechanical support to the chemical reformation. When the curl was dry and released, the strand sprang back from the cylinder shape in a wave whose depth and width were determined by the diameter of the curl, the tension at which it was wound, and the specific humidity of the environment in which it dried. A curl wound tight on a small base produced a deep, narrow wave, A curl wound loose on a wide base produced a gentler, broader movement. A skilled setter could produce, across the 72 to 100 curl sections into which a head of hair was typically divided, a perfectly choreographed map of curl directions that would, when brushed out, assemble themselves into the specific aesthetic effect intended. The directional map was everything. This is the element of the pin curl ritual that most clearly distinguished the skilled practitioner from the amateur, and that professional hairdressers of the era spent years studying and perfecting. Not all curls rolled in the same direction. A wave pattern in a finished hairstyle required that adjacent rows of curls be wound in alternating directions, so that when the curls were released, the waves folded against each other and interlocked into the smooth, continuous movement that characterized the finished look. A row of curls wound entirely in the same direction would release not into waves but into ringlets. Charming, perhaps, but architecturally incorrect for the smooth, swept silhouette the era preferred. The women who could execute the directional map correctly, who could hold the finished style in their mind's eye while working on the back sections of their own head, with their arms above them for 45 minutes, were acknowledged in their communities as possessing a genuine skill. The tools required were modest by today's standards. The primary implement was the bobby pin, a simple bent wire clip available in two sizes, the standard and the fine wavy, whose texture provided additional grip that could be used to secure the wound curl flat to the scalp and to hold individual sections while the setter worked through the head methodically. Metal sectioning clips, spring-loaded and with a slightly different geometry than the bobby pin, were used where greater security was needed or where the bobby pin's relatively flat profile would have disrupted the adjacent curl. A tail comb, a narrow-toothed comb with an elongated pointed handle, was used to section the hair precisely and to smooth each section before winding, and a hairnet, almost always, over the finished set, because the night's sleep could displace curls, and a displaced curl meant a gap in the wave pattern, and a gap in the wave pattern meant visible failure in the morning when there was no time to correct it. The morning procedure was the counterpart and reward of the Saturday night labour. After the neck came off and the pins came out, and the act of removing pins from a fully dried set had its own particular satisfaction, the slight springiness of the released curl, the way the hair held its shape even as the tension was removed, the brushing began. Here was where skill produced its most visible result. The purpose of the brush was not to straighten the curls but to blend them, to work through the separate sections and merge them into continuous waves, smoothing the surface while preserving the internal architecture. Too much brushing produced a frizzy, poofy result. Too little left the individual curls visible as such, which was the aesthetic signature of the amateur. The correct amount, perhaps 100 strokes with a bristle brush, followed by a gentle coaxing with the hands and a final smoothing with a comb, produced the look that the era's beauty vocabulary described as set, contained, smooth, structured and apparently natural. The home permanent wave solution deserves its own consideration, because without it the pin curl ritual would have been available only to women with naturally wavy or curly hair. The cold wave permanent developed in the 1940s through a chemical discovery that used thioglycolate as a reducing agent to break the disulfide bonds of the hair's structural protein and then reform them in a new configuration, allowed straight hair to hold curl. By the early 1950s, the home permanent wave has been packaged and marketed under several major brand names. Tony, with its famous advertising slogan, "Which twin has the Tony?" The answer being that both twins had identical soft waves, one achieved at a salon and one at home with the Tony kit, and that the at-home result was indistinguishable. Lilt, which competed directly with Tony on claims of softness and ease of application, and Ogilvy, which positioned itself as the salon-quality option for the more discerning consumer. The Home Permanent was a two-part chemical process that required careful timing and precise application. The waving lotion was applied first, saturating each wound section and initiating the bond-breaking chemistry. The neutralizer followed after a precisely specified development period. Too short and the wave would not set fully. Too long and the hair would be damaged or over-processed. The smell was distinctive and not pleasant, a sharp chemical odour that the advertising materials of the era described in their copy with commendable creativity, employing phrases like fresh, clean, and like spring rain, with the cheerful dishonesty that characterized much consumer product marketing of the period. The entire system, the setting lotion, the directional map, the overnight drying, the careful morning brushing, was a technology of self-transformation built entirely from simple chemical and physical principles, executed by ordinary women in their own bathrooms without professional training, producing results that were genuinely impressive and genuinely beautiful. The Saturday night set was not merely a beauty ritual. It was a technical achievement, repeated weekly, performed in private, requiring discipline and knowledge and time, and producing something that the woman who emerged from it on Sunday morning understood, with the quiet satisfaction of craftsmanship, that she had made herself. The social geography of the pin curl set extended beyond the bedroom vanity and into the neighbourhood itself, because the Saturday evening ritual was conducted not only by individual women in individual homes, but by small communities of women who shared the knowledge, the products, and sometimes the physical labour of the set. The neighbour who was also a skilled setter, who could reach the back sections that were most difficult to do alone, who could check the directional map for errors that the setter herself could not see in the triptych mirror. This neighbour was a resource, and the exchange of these services created a texture of practical female intimacy in the suburbs of the 1950s that is sometimes overlooked in accounts of the era that emphasize isolation and conformity. Setting each other's hair was a form of mutual care that required touch, trust, and shared aesthetic knowledge, and it created bonds among women that were neither romantic nor merely social, but something in the category of practical solidarity. The conversation that accompanied these sessions was the other component of their social value. Hair setting takes time. A full set on a head of medium-length hair required 45 minutes to an hour, and then the drying time, which was typically spent under a hood dryer, or simply sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, while the set dried naturally. This was time given over to talk, to the specific quality of conversation that domestic women of the era found most difficult to access in their daily routines. Unhurried, digressive, free of the instrumental agenda that organized most of the rest of domestic life. The conversation at the hair-setting session was not about household management or child development or social scheduling, though these topics appeared. It was the kind of talking that exists for its own sake, that goes where it goes, and that creates in its unhurried movement the sense of knowing and being known that is one of the fundamental human social requirements. The Tony Home Permanent Waves advertising campaign deserves more attention than it typically receives in histories of the period, because it was doing something culturally significant beyond its obvious commercial function. The "Which Twin Has the Tony" campaign, which ran from 1949 through the mid-1950s in newspapers and women's magazines across the country, featured pairs of identical twin women, one of whom had had her hair professionally waved at a salon, and one of whom had used the Tony Home kit, with the challenge to the viewer to identify which twin had which treatment. The campaign's implicit argument was that the professional service and the home product were genuinely equivalent in their results, and it was making this argument at a specific cultural moment when the boundary between the professional domain and the domestic domain was being renegotiated on several fronts simultaneously. If a woman could produce a result equivalent to a professional salon's in her own bathroom, what else could she produce at home that had previously required professional service? The question was not merely about hair. The chemistry of the setting lotion interacted with the individual chemistry of each woman's hair in ways that made the results of the identical technique genuinely variable across different users, and this variability was a source of both the ritual's frustration and its fascination. A lotion that produced a beautiful, long-lasting wave on fine, naturally wavy hair would produce a flat, quickly falling result on thick, resistant hair. The adaptation of technique to hair type was a knowledge that accumulated through experience and that was passed between women as practical intelligence about products, timing, and application methods that the product labels, written for the mythical average user, did not provide. The woman who had figured out through trial and error that she needed twice the standard setting lotion quantity for her particular hair type, or that her waves fell out in humidity unless she used the heaviest available gel formula, was in possession of practical knowledge that she had earned through disappointment and that she shared generously with the women in her community who were still learning. The sound of the brush through a finished set, the particular rustling, softly crackling sound of hair that has been chemically set and held through the night and is now being worked through carefully with a bristle brush, is one of those sensory details that women who grew up in the era have described with remarkable consistency as powerful in its associations. It was the sound of completion, of the week's preparation reaching its appointed moment. It was the sound of the private becoming the public, of the self being assembled for presentation. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the sound of transformation. In September of 1953, the Patricia Stevens Finishing School in Chicago enrolled its largest cohort of students since its founding in the post-war years, 312 women ranging in age from 16 to 38, each of whom had paid a tuition fee equivalent to several weeks of an average working woman's salary to learn, in the school's own prospectus language, the art of becoming. The prospectus did not specify becoming what exactly, though the curriculum made the answer clear enough. Becoming the kind of woman who moved through formal social situations without betraying evidence of uncertainty, who could construct the correct introductory remark for any social configuration, who carried herself with a specific physical grammar that communicated, before she opened her mouth, that she was a person who understood how things were done. The finishing school as an American institution had roots in the 19th century European tradition of the pension or house of education for young women of good family, but by the 1950s it had undergone a democratic transformation that made it, in theory, if not always in practice, available to any woman who could afford the tuition and aspired to a version of refinement defined by a relatively recent and specifically American set of criteria. Schools like Patricia Stevens, Powers Model Agency's Charm Division, and the John Robert Powers School, whose founder had built an enormously successful modeling agency, and who understood, with the commercial clarity of a brilliant entrepreneur, that the skills required for modeling were a commercial version of the skills that all women of the era were being told they needed, operated in cities throughout the country, and their correspondence courses extended their reach further still. The posture curriculum was the physical foundation of everything else, and the book balancing exercise that has become the era's most recognized symbol of finishing school pedagogy was not, in fact, merely symbolic. The exercise of walking with a book balanced on the crown of the head forced a specific alignment of the body that the schools taught as the correct template for all formal movement. The chin lifted to approximately parallel with the floor, not elevated, which produced a look of arrogance, and not depressed, which communicated timidity. The shoulders dropped from the ears and pressed back sufficiently to open the chest cavity, not rigidly squared, which read as military but gently aligned. The spine elongated from the tailbone through the crown, the lower abdominal muscles engaged to prevent a sway-back posture that was considered both physically unflattering and socially communicative of sloppiness. The walk itself was an elaborate specification. Patricia Stevens' instruction materials of the period, copies of which survive in archival collections, describe the correct forward movement with the language of engineering. Each step to be placed slightly to the inside of the foot's natural trajectory, so that the left and right footfalls were almost but not quite aligned on a single centre line, producing the slight hip movement that was considered elegant without being provocative. The length of each stride was to be proportionate to the height of the woman. Too long a stride was unfeminine, too short a stride was mincing, and the transition of weight from heel to toe was to be continuous and smooth rather than percussive. The shoes mattered. A 1.5 to 2 inch heel was the standard recommendation for daytime wear at the period. The height sufficient to pitch the body forward slightly onto the ball of the foot in a way that altered the silhouette, tilting the pelvis and raising the heel line in a configuration that the era's aesthetic vocabulary classified as attractive. The grammar of introductions was a formal system with specific rules, and learning it was, at the finishing schools of the 1950s, treated with the seriousness of a legal code. The hierarchy of introductions was clear. A younger person was always introduced to an older person. A man was always introduced to a woman. A person of lower status or lesser social prominence was always introduced to the person of higher status or greater prominence. The language of the introduction was itself specified. Mrs. Harrison, may I present Mr. Collins, was correct, while Mrs. Harrison, meet Mr. Collins was explicitly incorrect. The word meet being classified as too casual for formal situations regardless of the actual social register of the event. I'd like you to meet fell somewhere in between, and was considered acceptable in business context but not ideal in purely social ones. The handshake for women was a particular area of instruction. The 1950s finishing school taught the firm handshake to women with a fervour that recognised, without quite naming it, that women entering professional and business life needed a physical greeting equivalent in authority to the male handshake, while the social handshake, the brief, gloved clasp at a party, the offered hand to be bowed over in a formal reception, required a completely different weight and approach. The gloved hand was never to be removed for a handshake in a formal social context. This rule was absolute. The logic behind it was rooted in the fashion economics of the era. Evening gloves were beautiful, expensive, and constructed of materials including kid leather and silk jersey that did not survive repeated contact with the body chemistry of multiple hands, and removing them in the course of an evening was therefore wasteful and unnecessary, given that the social handshake was not designed to convey the professional solidity of the business grip, but simply to acknowledge presence and communicate courtesy. Conversational mechanics were taught as precisely as physical ones. The Patricia Stevens and John Robert Powers schools both devoted significant curriculum time to what might be called conversation choreography. The management of topics, the navigation of conversational transitions, the specific verbal formulas for entering and exiting a group conversation at a cocktail or dinner party. The rules were extensive. You did not discuss religion or politics at a dinner table unless the host had specifically introduced the subject. And even then you expressed your own position with a qualification that left room for disagreement without conflict. You did not discuss money in social settings, not the price of anything, not the cost of the dress you were wearing or the amount of your husband's salary or the value of the house you were considering purchasing. You did not discuss medical matters in mixed company. You did not discuss the problems or failures of absent third parties, because this was gossip, and while gossip was acknowledged to be universal and frequently entertaining, its public practice was classified as a failure of breeding. The physical management of eating and drinking at formal occasions received detailed attention. The finishing school student of the 1950s learned to manage a fork and knife with the European style. Tines down, knife in the right hand throughout the cutting, transferred to the left hand to convey food to the mouth, because this was considered more refined than the American style of cutting, and then switching the fork to the right hand. She learned the placement of silverware to signal to the waiting staff that she was mid-meal versus finished. She learned the correct angle at which a spoon was to be tipped in a soup bowl, away from the body, moving outward to the far edge of the bowl, then lifted, and that soup was taken from the side of the spoon, never the tip, and that the bowl was never tilted toward the body to access the remaining liquid at the bottom. What the finishing school was actually teaching, beneath all the specific rules about handshakes and soup spoons and conversational topics, was a system of attention management. The woman who had completed the curriculum could, in any formal social situation, devote her conscious awareness to the conversation, to the people, to the actual content and pleasure of the occasion, because the physical management of her own behavior, the posture, the walk, the introduction, the handshake, the fork, had been automatized through practice into habit. This is precisely what athletic and performance training does. It moves technical execution from conscious attention into unconscious competence, freeing the practitioner's awareness for the higher order activity. Today, the finishing school is largely extinct as a formal institution, but its curriculum has migrated rather than disappeared. Presence and posture coaching, executive communication training, social skills courses for professional development. These modern practices are structurally identical to the Patricia Stevens curriculum. The specific rules have changed. There is no longer a universal hierarchy of introduction. The gloved handshake has entirely disappeared. Soup bowl direction is no longer a professional credential. But the underlying project remains, the construction of a self that can move through formal social situations with an ease that appears natural while being, in fact, thoroughly studied and practiced. The telephone etiquette curriculum of the finishing schools of the 1950s was, by the middle of the decade, occupying an increasing share of the instructional time, because the telephone had by then become the primary medium of social coordination in the suburban domestic landscape, and its correct use was understood to be as revealing of a woman's social formation as any of the traditional physical behaviours. The charm school telephone lesson covered several distinct topics: the correct form of greeting for a social call versus a business call, the management of message taking for household members who are not available, the appropriate length of social calls and the techniques for gracefully ending a call that had exceeded its natural conclusion, and the specific forms of apology and thanks that various calling occasions required. The correct greeting for a social telephone call was good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, followed by one's name. Good afternoon. This is Mrs. Harrison speaking. The form hello without identification was classified as suitable for the home telephone answered in expectation of a known caller but inappropriate for calls placed outward or for any business context. The message-taking lesson was particularly detailed because the management of telephone messages in a household with multiple adults and potentially a domestic employee created multiple opportunities for error, and error in message management could have social consequences ranging from a missed appointment to a failed hostess responsibility. The message was to be repeated back to the caller, written down immediately on the pad that sat beside every correctly appointed household telephone, and delivered to the intended recipient in its written form as well as verbally. The deportment lessons that addressed the physical self in professional and social contexts beyond the home addressed a question that had become acute in the 1950s as more women entered professional employment: how to move through a world that had been designed around the physical conventions of male professional behavior. The office of the 1950s, with its particular spatial and social conventions, presented a set of challenges for the professional woman that the finishing school attempted to prepare her for. Though the preparation was necessarily limited by the extent to which the school's curriculum was built around social contexts, the dinner party, the charitable committee, the country club, rather than professional ones. The crossing of the legs, for instance, was a topic of serious instruction. The correct position for a seated woman in a formal context was either both feet on the floor with the knees together, or one leg crossed over the other at the ankle rather than the knee. The ankle cross was considered the more refined position for formal social sitting, because it kept the skirt geometry intact and could be maintained comfortably, even in very formal floor-length dress. The knee cross was acceptable in less formal contexts, but required careful management of the skirt to prevent unintended visual revelation, and in very short skirts, a fashion that was still, in the early 1950s, considered somewhat daring, was simply not practical. The curriculum of the correspondence course versions of finishing school education, which reached women in smaller cities and rural areas who had no access to a residential or day program, was conducted through a series of mimeographed or printed lessons delivered by mail and accompanied by exercises that the student completed and returned for comment. These correspondence courses are historically interesting because they preserved, in their mailed materials, a documentary record of the curriculum in a more stable form than the classroom instruction, which was ephemeral. The surviving correspondence course materials from schools like the American Institute of Social Studies, which operated a charm and personality course through mail during the 1950s and early 60s, reveal a curriculum that was simultaneously more ambitious in its scope and more modest in its social aspirations than the residential programs. Where the residential programs aimed at producing women capable of moving in formal social circles, the correspondence course aimed primarily at producing women confident in the ordinary social encounters of daily life, the job interview, the new neighbour, the formal introduction to a supervisor's family. The legacy of these schools, and of the culture of deliberate social formation they represented, appears most clearly today in the therapeutic and coaching industries that have taken up their functions. The executive presence coach, the communication skills trainer, the social anxiety therapist. These practitioners are all addressing, with different tools and in different vocabularies, the same fundamental human need that the finishing school addressed: the need to feel adequate to the social situations one encounters, to move through the world with a sense of preparation rather than perpetual improvisation. There is a class of objects from the 1950s that have moved, in the decades since their manufacture, from the category of utilitarian cosmetic tool into the category of collectible luxury goods, and the trajectory of that reclassification tells you something precise about what the objects were and what they meant at the moment of their creation. The powder compact of the 1950s was a functional object, certainly. It held compressed face powder and a small mirror and a puff, and it was designed to be carried in a handbag and used in public to refresh the face's powder between morning application and the demands of the day. But it was also, and perhaps primarily, a status object, a piece of the decorative arts expressed at handbag scale, and the companies that manufactured the finest examples understood themselves to be operating in the tradition of the jeweller as much as the cosmetic chemist. Stratton of Birmingham, England, was by the 1950s the dominant producer of what the trade called quality compacts, a category distinct from the pressed metal compacts available at drugstores and five and dimes, in the same way that a Swiss watch is distinct from a mass-market timepiece. The Stratton compact was distinguished by its self-opening mechanism, a patented spring-loaded hinge that opened the case when a button was pressed, without requiring the user to use her fingernails to pry the lid, and by the quality of its materials and finishing. The bodies were made of gilt metal, gold-plated silver, or solid silver, depending on the price point, and the lids were decorated in a range of techniques that included engine turning, a process of precise mechanical engraving that produced the guilloche patterns, the intersecting geometric lines and waveforms that gave the metal surface its characteristic shimmering depth that had been associated with fine decorative metalwork since the 18th century. The American market had its own premium compact producers, most notably Volupté, whose elaborately designed gold tone and silver tone cases were advertised in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, with the confidence of a jewellery house rather than a cosmetic supplier, and Elgin American, whose Minaudière compact purse combinations occupied the upper end of the market with a price point that put them unambiguously in the gift category rather than the personal purchase category. These objects appeared in jewellery store vitrines alongside rings and bracelets, wrapped in gift boxes with ribbon, presented as anniversary and birthday gifts by husbands who understood, because the advertising told them clearly, that a beautiful compact was the kind of gift that acknowledged the labour of femininity while presenting it as pleasure. The act of using the compact in public was governed by a social protocol as specific as any of the finishing school rules. The nose-powdering gesture, the compact opened, the puff lifted and pressed lightly against the face in a dabbing motion, was acceptable in certain social contexts and not in others, and the line between the two was determined by the formality of the occasion and the company present. At a restaurant table, a woman might touch her nose with the compact puff at the end of a meal. This was accepted. She would not perform the gesture mid-conversation, because turning one's attention to one's own appearance in the midst of an exchange with another person was coded as rudeness, as an implicit communication that the physical management of one's face was more pressing than the person speaking. She would certainly not apply lipstick at the table, which was classified as definitively incorrect by all etiquette authorities of the period regardless of the company or context. The ladies' room existed for precisely this purpose, and the social geography of the 1950s, the powder room in every formal home, the ladies' lounge in every department store and theatre and quality restaurant, was organised in part around the need to provide a private space for public-facing cosmetic maintenance. The compact mirror was a moral instrument as much as a reflective one. The portable mirror that every compact contained, small, typically round, with the slightly distorted optics of a thin metal-backed mirror rather than the true clarity of a glass one, was the means by which a woman checked her appearance in public life, and the frequency and manner of this checking was itself socially regulated. A woman who checked her appearance too often was vain. A woman who never checked it was careless. The correct frequency and manner suggested a relaxed competence, a confidence in one's preparation that required only the occasional verification rather than continuous anxious monitoring. The powder itself, the compressed face powder that filled the compact's interior, had its own technological history and its own brand hierarchy. Coty, whose air-spun loose powder had been a market leader since the 1920s, had by the 1950s adapted its most popular formulations into compact form, selling pressed powder under the Coty Compact designation that carried the aspirational weight of a French heritage, even though the company's American operations had long since become the dominant arm of the business. Max Factor, Elizabeth Arden, and Charles of the Ritz each produced pressed powder lines that occupied the premium end of the department store market, while the drugstore market was served by Revlon, Maybelline, and a proliferating array of mid-tier brands whose advertising competed fiercely on the vocabulary of skin improvement, matte finish, natural finish, flawless coverage, skin-toned perfection. The shade selection in pressed powder was limited by contemporary standards to a range that implicitly assumed a customer of European descent. The shades ran from porcelain through ivory through beige through tan, with a few darker options that the advertising invariably described as suntan or golden, a framing that positioned warmth of skin tone as a summer accessory rather than an identity. This limitation was not incidental. It was a direct product of the marketing assumptions of the era, which constructed the American beauty consumer as implicitly white and organized its product development accordingly. The women who did not see their skin tones represented in the compact shade range did not disappear from the market. They simply navigated it differently, mixing products, improvising formulations, or finding specialty suppliers whose product development had not written them out of the brief. The compact as collectible began its second life in the 1970s and 80s, when the first generation of women who had used these objects in their original context began encountering them at estate sales and antique markets, and recognizing in them something they had not quite felt at the point of original purchase. A quality of making, a density of material and intention that distinguished them from their contemporary equivalents. The engine-turned Stratton compact that had sat on a woman's vanity from 1953 to 1968 was, by 1975, something more than a cosmetic tool. It was a residue of an aesthetic that had placed tremendous value on the quality of small things, on the investment of craft and material in objects that were designed to be carried in a pocket and pulled out at a restaurant table. The beauty of the object had outlasted its function. Today, the vintage compact market is robust, supported by collectors who recognize in these objects a lost vocabulary of material seriousness. The Stratton engine-turned compact in good condition commands prices that would have surprised its original buyer. The Volupté Novelty Compact, produced in the shapes of fans and lanterns and miniature suitcases, designed as much for display as for use, is particularly sought. And the more modest examples, the drugstore Coty Compacts and the simple gilt Elgin Americans, are collected not for their material value, but for what they communicate about a particular moment in the history of women's daily life, a moment when the powder compact was serious enough to be beautiful and beautiful enough to be serious. The relationship between the compact and the mirror it contained was philosophically denser than it might appear, because the act of looking at oneself in public, however briefly and practically it occurred, raised the question that had attached itself to female self-regard in Western culture for centuries. Was the looking vanity, or was it simply maintenance? And where exactly did maintenance end and vanity begin? The distinction mattered to the women of the 1950s in a way that it perhaps does not matter to subsequent generations, because the charge of vanity, of excessive and inappropriate preoccupation with one's own appearance, was a moral charge with genuine social consequence. A woman known for her vanity was understood to be prioritizing the self over the domestic collective, and in the social economy of the post-war suburb, where the value of feminine selflessness was very high, this prioritization was a failing with real costs. The compact resolved this tension through its form. The compact was small. It performed its function quickly and discreetly. It permitted the minimum necessary self-examination and refreshment, without providing the infrastructure for extended aesthetic contemplation. The small and slightly imperfect mirror of the compact was adequate for checking whether a lipstick needed refreshing or a nose needed powdering, but it was not adequate for the sustained, comprehensive self-examination that might justify the charge of vanity. The compact was the beauty culture's answer to the moral problem of female self-regard, a technology that enabled the necessary maintenance while structurally limiting the indulgence. The enamel work on the most beautiful compacts of the 1950s deserves its own aesthetic consideration. The guilloché enamel technique, in which translucent enamel is applied over a machine-engraved metal surface. The engraving visible through the enamel in a shimmering depth effect, was a technique with origins in the Fabergé workshops of the Russian imperial court, and had reached the decorative arts of the compact through the same genealogy that produced the finest pocket watches and cigarette cases of the Art Deco period. The colour range of the guilloché enamel compact was exquisite. The pale, translucent greens and blues and pinks that the technique produced at its finest were colours that existed nowhere else in the material world of the 1950s, colours that had a liquid depth and a tonal complexity that solid painted surfaces could not achieve. The market for these objects was sufficiently developed by the mid-1950s to support a significant secondary trade in antique and vintage compacts, a fact that reveals something important about how the objects were understood by their buyers. Women who purchased an antique Victorian or Art Deco compact at an antique shop or estate sale were not merely buying a functional object that could be used for its original purpose, though it could, and sometimes was. They were buying a connection to a lineage of decorative craftsmanship that the mass-manufactured products of the post-war era, however well made within their own conventions, could not provide. The Victorian silver compact engraved with a floral pattern, the Art Deco geometric case in black enamel and gilt, the Edwardian compact with its cartouched initials. These objects were antiques in the precise sense that their value derived partly from their historical relationship to a period of making that had passed. The display of cosmetic accessories in the home was governed by the same aesthetic standards that governed the display of any other decorative object, and the vanity table arrangement was understood as an expression of the woman's aesthetic intelligence in a way that the kitchen arrangement, organised primarily by function, was not. A collection of beautiful compact cases and perfume bottles and crystal powder jars arranged on a mirrored tray on the vanity surface was a composition, and its quality, the discrimination of the selection, the harmony of the arrangement, the balance of materials and scales, was legible to any visitor who entered the bedroom and reflected on its owner accordingly. The annual gift-giving occasions of the 1950s, birthdays, Christmas, Valentine's Day, anniversaries, organised themselves around a hierarchy of appropriate gifts for women that placed cosmetic accessories in a particular position. They were appropriate at almost every relationship level, from the casual acquaintance to the husband, and at almost every price point, from the modest to the extravagant. This universality made them the default gift of the era, and the compact specifically, with its combination of utility and beauty, its association with self-care and elegance, its ability to be presented beautifully and to last for years as a daily reminder of the giver, was perhaps the ideal gift of the 1950s as the decade itself understood that category. The bar cart arrived at the Eisenhower-era suburban home by the same logic that drove the purchase of every other domestic appliance and furniture item of the decade. If a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing with the correct equipment, displayed with pride, and performed with a thoroughness that could be observed and assessed by guests. The bar cart of the 1950s was not merely a piece of furniture. It was a declaration of sociability, a piece of theatre equipment stationed in the living room or dining room and ready to demonstrate on any Friday or Saturday evening when the neighbours or the colleagues or the country club acquaintances were expected, that this household understood how civilised entertaining was conducted. The domestic entertaining culture of the 1950s was one of the decade's most elaborate social forms, and its elaborateness was not accidental. The post-war prosperity that had moved millions of American families from apartments into houses and from houses into suburbs had created a new social geography in which the home itself was the primary arena of social performance. There were no cafes in the suburb of 1955 in the sense that European cities understood the term. No places where adults went to sit and converse over small coffees for hours without any other commercial transaction implied. The neighbour's living room was the substitute, and the cocktail hour that preceded the dinner party or followed the bridge game or organised the Saturday evening of the development was the social technology that made that living room hospitable. The hostess of the era, and it was almost invariably the woman who bore the primary responsibility for the planning, preparation, and execution of the event, operated according to a set of standards whose complexity was proportional to the social stakes of the occasion. A casual gathering of two couples who saw each other weekly required less of her than a dinner for 8 that included her husband's employer and his wife. But both required considerably more than the 21st century equivalent would typically demand, because the mid-century entertaining aesthetic was built on abundance and specificity, rather than the calculated artlessness that contemporary hospitality culture prefers. The deviled egg is as good an entry point as any into this world, because it illustrates the principles with precision. The deviled egg of the 1950s was a dish of genuine labour. The eggs to be hard-boiled in precisely timed water, cooled immediately in ice water to prevent the grey ring around the yolk that signified overboiling, peeled without damage, halved with a clean knife wiped between each cut, the yolks removed intact and pressed through a sieve, or mashed and then combined with mayonnaise, preferably Hellmann's or Best Foods, the brand loyalty to which was as firmly held as any political conviction. Dry mustard, a precise quantity of white vinegar and seasoning, the mixture then piped through a pastry bag into the halved whites in a decorative swirl and finished with a dusting of paprika, placed symmetrically, and the entire tray arranged on a platter with the compositional attention of someone who understood that presentation was as important as flavour. The recipe does not seem extraordinary by contemporary standards, but in the context of 1950s entertaining culture, it carried significant freight. The deviled egg was one of the specific dishes whose execution was considered a reliable indicator of the hostess's basic competence. An easy dish that nevertheless required attention, timing, and the kind of small-scale aesthetic judgment that separated a woman who had mastered her kitchen from one who had not. The other members of this category included the perfect canapé, the smooth cheese dip, the reliably set aspic, and the correctly constructed frozen salad, a genre of dish that combined gelatin and whipped cream and canned fruit, or sometimes mayonnaise and vegetables in a configuration that sounds, from this distance, deeply improbable, but was in fact a standard element of the era's entertaining lexicon. The bar cart required its own preparation and its own expertise. The proper equipped bar of the 1950s included a range of spirits: bourbon, rye, scotch, gin, vodka, rum, and a selection of mixers including soda water, tonic, ginger ale, and the cola brands that had by the decade become standard household items. The crystal glassware was as important as the contents it held: the old-fashioned glass for whiskey drinks and those prepared without carbonation, the highball glass for long drinks with soda or mixer, the cocktail glass, the distinctive wide-rimmed martini shape, immediately recognizable as the visual emblem of mid-century drinking culture, for the chilled and stirred preparations that were served without ice. The martini itself occupied a particular position in the cocktail culture of the 1950s that requires some attention. It was the prestige drink of the era, the drink whose preparation was used to assess the host's knowledge and judgment, the drink about which enormous quantities of opinion were expressed about the relative proportions of gin to dry vermouth that constituted the correct formula. The debate between dry and very dry had been running since the 1920s, when the standard martini ratio had been something in the neighbourhood of 2-to-1 gin to vermouth, and had by the mid-1950s reached the point where some authorities recommended ratios of 10 or 12-to-1, and the humorist Bernard DeVoto had written, in his famous 1951 essay on the subject, that the correct preparation of the martini required gin, ice, and the presence in the room of an unopened bottle of vermouth, this presence being sufficient influence. The conversation about martini ratios was not merely about the drink. It was about connoisseurship, about the performance of having standards, about the kind of expertise in small pleasures that the decade's prosperity had made newly available and newly important as a social credential. The conversation flow management that the hostess was responsible for was the most invisible and most demanding element of the evening's labour. A dinner party of 8 persons seated at a table for 2 hours produced, under the laws of social dynamics, a conversation that had the potential to go in many directions, not all of them appropriate for a gathering whose purpose was pleasure and social harmony, rather than genuine intellectual exchange or emotional disclosure. The hostess's role included monitoring the conversational temperature of the room, intervening when a topic threatened to produce disagreement, redirecting when a guest monopolized or dominated, ensuring that the quieter guests were drawn into the general exchange, and managing the transition from cocktail hour to table to after-dinner conversation with a timing that felt natural rather than choreographed, though it was invariably the latter. The physical geometry of the table itself was part of this management. The arrangement of guests, who sat next to whom, who faced whom across the table, was determined by a calculation that took into account the social compatibilities and professional relationships and personal histories of the guests, and a hostess who performed this geometry correctly produced a table that felt effortlessly convivial, where conversation arose naturally and no one felt stranded beside an incompatible neighbour. A hostess who performed it incorrectly produced a table that required constant intervention to prevent awkwardness, and this failure was noted and discussed afterward among the guests, with the mixture of sympathy and judgment that social failure always attracted in the tightly woven communities of the post-war suburb. The physical objects of the cocktail hour had a beauty that was not incidental to their function. The crystal highball glass caught and refracted the living room lamplight. The silver cocktail shaker was polished to a mirror finish. The paper cocktail napkin, a relatively new product in the early 1950s, mass-manufactured and printed with whimsical designs that became a minor collecting category of their own, was placed precisely. The ice bucket gleamed. The whole apparatus was designed not merely to hold and dispense, but to be beheld, to communicate through its quality and arrangement that the host and hostess had given this gathering their best attention, and that the guests were worth it. The architecture of the menu for a dinner party of 8 was a document of social calculation that the era's hostess approached with the seriousness of a business proposal. The menu was not simply a list of foods. It was a coordinated system in which flavor, texture, color, season, and social impression had to be balanced against each other and against the practical constraints of a domestic kitchen operated by 1 or at most 2 people, the hostess, and, in households that could afford one, a domestic employee brought in for the evening. The menu had to include foods that could be prepared entirely or substantially in advance, so that the hostess was not confined to the kitchen during the party itself, but could be present in the social space performing the hosting functions that were equally her responsibility. It had to include foods whose serving did not require precision timing that would interrupt the flow of conversation, and it had to achieve, in its overall impression when presented at table, the combination of elegance and abundance that the era classified as the evidence of a good household. The aspic was the savoury equivalent of the gelatin dessert in the mid-century entertaining repertoire, and its preparation was among the most technically demanding operations in the domestic cook's vocabulary. A perfect aspic, a moulded preparation of savoury gelatin typically containing meat, seafood, or vegetables suspended in a clear stock clarified to perfect transparency, required the correct balance of gelatin to liquid for a set that was firm enough to hold its shape when unmoulded but soft enough to quiver attractively on the serving plate, and a stock clarified through the process of combining it with a mixture of egg white and ground meat, heating until the proteins coagulated and trapped the stock's impurities, and then straining through a napkin-lined sieve to produce a liquid of perfect jewel-like clarity. This process, called clarification or the consommé method, was one of the techniques by which domestic cooks of the era demonstrated their command of the classical French culinary tradition that the American entertaining culture of the 1950s took as its aspiration, even when it served food that was not French. The influence of Julia Child in this context deserves acknowledgement, though she is in some respects a figure of the cusp between the period under discussion and the period that followed. The television programme The French Chef, which first aired on WGBH in Boston in February of 1963, was the product of her collaboration with her husband Paul Child and with the editors at Alfred A. Knopf, who had published Mastering the Art of French Cooking in 1961. This work and this programme were building on, rather than creating from nothing, an existing American fascination with French culinary technique that had been building through the 1950s as prosperity, international travel, and the cultural prestige of France in the post-war Atlanticist imagination combined to make French food the aspirational cuisine of the educated middle class. The hostesses of the late 1950s who were attempting beef bourguignon and coq au vin from magazine recipes and the first edition of James Beard's books were laying the cultural groundwork for Child's success. The crystal and silver on the table were maintained with a labour that has largely disappeared from contemporary domestic life, because the materials themselves have largely disappeared. Sterling silver flatware and serving pieces required regular polishing with a silver polish that removed the tarnish, a chemical reaction between silver and atmospheric sulfur compounds that accumulated constantly on exposed silver surfaces. The polishing was performed with a soft cloth, a rotary motion that worked the polish into the surface and then a second cloth to buff to brilliance, and it was typically done the day before the event for which the silver would be needed. Crystal required hand washing, because the dishwasher's heat and the alkaline detergent of the era would both eventually etch the glass, dulling its brilliance. The hand washing of crystal, with its particular combination of delicacy required by the material and care required by the value, was itself a kind of a ritual completion, the final act of preparation that readied the objects for their role in the event. The after-dinner coffee service was the period's equivalent of the modern dessert bar, an elaborate counter of options that allowed guests to customize their conclusion to the meal. Coffee service in the 1950s entertaining context typically involved a formal silver or silver plate coffee service, pot, creamer, sugar bowl, arranged on a tray and carried to the living room where the after-dinner portion of the evening took place. The offering of demi-tasse cups for the small, strong coffee that the French service prescribed versus the full-sized cups for the lighter American style was itself a statement about the level of the occasion and the culinary sophistication of the household. A woman dressing for an ordinary Tuesday morning in 1955, preparing to walk to the bus stop and commute to her secretarial position at a downtown insurance firm, would put on, in more or less this order, her undergarments, followed by a girdle even if her figure did not require one in any functional sense, followed by a garter belt and nylons, followed by a half slip, and then a full slip over that, followed by her blouse, followed by her skirt or dress, followed by shoes with a heel, followed by gloves that matched neither necessarily the colour of anything else she was wearing, but that completed the ensemble in a way that the era classified as essential. She did not leave the house without all of these layers, not because the weather required them, because they were the correct configuration of a dressed adult woman, and appearing in public in anything less, without the gloves, without the hose, without the slip, was not so much a casual choice as a social statement, a statement that she had not fully participated in the morning's assembly of her own public self. The foundation garment, the girdle, or its more structured relative, the corset, or its more elaborate manifestation, the all-in-one merry widow, was the architectural base of the 1950s silhouette. The silhouette of the decade was the new look, a term coined by the fashion press to describe the aesthetic that Christian Dior had introduced in 1947, and which had, by the early 1950s, descended through the entire pyramid of American fashion, from the Paris original to the 7th Avenue adaptation to the department store line to the simplicity in McCall's pattern, from which the home seamstress constructed her version. The new look silhouette was specific: a small defined waist, a rounded hip and bust, a skirt that fell to mid-calf and whose volume was created either by the cut of the fabric itself or, more practically, by the layers of stiffened petticoats worn beneath it. This silhouette required the female body to conform to a geometry that natural human bodies only approximated at their most favourable, and the foundation garment industry was the engineering solution to that approximation. The girdle of the early 1950s was a formidable object. The leading manufacturer Playtex had pioneered the use of latex in foundation wear, and their products, the Playtex Living Girdle, the Playtex Longline Bra, and the Playtex 18-Hour Bra, which advertised its capacity to be worn for the entirety of the waking day without discomfort, with the enthusiasm of a manufacturer who understood that the promise of comfort in a product that was fundamentally uncomfortable was its most powerful selling proposition, were constructed of a rubberized fabric that compressed the torso through passive tension. The compression was real, and the restriction was real, and women who wore these garments through a working day or an evening of entertainment were performing their social roles in a physical condition that would seem, by 21st century standards, extreme. The foundation garment was tight by design. Its purpose was to alter the body's silhouette to conform to the decade's aesthetic standard, and the mechanism by which it achieved this was simply the application of external force. Warner's and Maidenform competed with Playtex for the American foundation garment market, and addressed the product's fundamental tension between beauty and comfort with varying commercial strategies. Maidenform's advertising campaign, which began in 1949 and ran throughout the 1950s, was the most culturally prominent, the "I Dreamed I Was" campaign, in which women in Maidenform bras were photographed in surrealist tableau, dreaming they were a fireman, a princess, a ballet dancer, while their undergarments were entirely visible, deployed a then-daring logic that distinguished the garment's aspirational quality by associating it with freedom and fantasy rather than restriction. The campaign was enormously successful commercially, and is now recognized by advertising historians as one of the most influential campaigns of the mid-century period, not least because it managed to sell a restrictive garment by advertising it as liberation. The nylon stocking was the second layer of the foundation wardrobe, and the one whose significance was most immediately practical. Nylon had been developed by DuPont in the 1930s and had been introduced to the commercial stocking market in 1940, producing lines of women waiting outside department stores the morning the product went on sale with the enthusiasm that characterized the introduction of genuinely transformative consumer technologies. The war had interrupted the civilian nylon supply entirely. Nylon was a military priority material, and the return of nylon stockings to the post-war market had been experienced by women of the generation who remembered rationing as something between relief and elation. By the early 1950s, nylon stockings were ubiquitous, available in the dime store as well as the department store, produced in a range of shades. The suntan, the barely there, the misty, the colour names a poetry of understatement, and worn as an absolute requirement of the dressed female body outside the domestic setting. The stocking ran. This was the central technical problem of 1950s hosiery, and the solutions to it occupied a significant portion of every woman's practical attention. A run, a ladder of broken stitches beginning at a snag point and proceeding in a straight line up or down the stocking's length, was immediately visible, aesthetically ruinous to the dressed look, and in certain formal or professional contexts practically humiliating. The standard solution was clear nail polish applied immediately to the end of the run to halt its progress, carried in the handbag for exactly this purpose. The more extreme solution was to carry a spare pair of stockings, folded precisely also in the handbag, available for replacement in the ladies' room. Neither solution prevented the run, they merely limited its damage. The fully laddered stocking, retired from active service, was often kept, stuffed with newspaper used for cleaning, repurposed for the storage of dry bulbs in the kitchen garden, because the material itself was too valuable in the post-scarcity era psychological economy to discard. The crinolined skirt that sat atop this foundation wardrobe was the most architecturally extraordinary element of the dressed silhouette. The crinoline, a stiffened petticoat made of tulle or organza, or a stiffened cotton called crinoline after the fabric, created the bell-shaped skirt volume that was the decade's most recognizable silhouette element. Multiple layers of crinoline, each separately stiffened with sizing or starch, built up a volume that required a specific kind of physical consciousness to manage, the awareness of one's own dimensional footprint in a room, the calculation of chair width and doorway clearance, the managed self-presentation in a bus seat or a restaurant banquette, that the volume of the skirt made more complex than it had been in the narrower silhouettes of the previous decades. The glove completed the ensemble and was the element whose removal most clearly signalled the passage from formal to informal territory. A woman in the 1950s wore gloves to church, to shopping at quality department stores, to lunch at a hotel restaurant, to any occasion that involved meeting people she did not already know in a private setting. She removed them to eat, occasionally to drink, and in private homes where the occasion was specifically informal. The gloves themselves range from cotton jersey in summer through kid leather in winter, in lengths ranging from the wrist length appropriate for most daytime occasions through the elbow length appropriate for formal afternoon and early evening events, through the full length above the elbow formal glove that was standard for black tie events and debutante presentations. The white glove was the most formal and the most demanding to maintain. Cotton and nylon could be washed, but the white kid leather glove required careful cleaning and reshaping after each wearing to prevent the leather from stiffening in an unflattering configuration. What this wardrobe communicated to any observer who shared the era's visual vocabulary was a taxonomy of the wearer's social position and her relationship to the occasion she was attending. The fully correct wardrobe, foundation garments in correct configuration, stockings without runs, gloves appropriate to the hour, communicated that the wearer had both the resources and the knowledge and the discipline to present herself according to the established standard. Any departure from this standard was read as a statement, intentional or otherwise, about where she stood relative to those standards and the values they encoded. The wardrobe was, in this sense, a continuous and involuntary autobiography, worn on the body daily, read by every eye that encountered it, and understood with the rapid precision that social coding always achieves in a culture that has agreed on its grammar. The hat was an element of the 1950s woman's wardrobe that has been less thoroughly discussed than the girdle or the gloves, but that was equally obligatory in formal social contexts, and that functioned as one of the most visible single indicators of the occasion's social register. The millinery of the 1950s was in its final decade of obligatory status. By the mid-1960s, hatless women would become unremarkable in most social contexts outside of church and formal occasions, but during the decade itself the hat was worn to church, to shopping in downtown department stores, to formal afternoon events, and to any occasion that required the full-dressed presentation of the adult woman. The millinery industry was consequently enormous, and the hat departments of department stores across the country were staffed by trained milliners who could advise on the selection of the correct hat for a specific occasion, face shape, and costume. The hat of the 1950s was not a single thing but a vocabulary of forms, each appropriate to specific occasions and moments of the day. The pillbox hat, which would become indelibly associated with Jackie Kennedy in the early 1960s, was already established in the mid-1950s as a streamlined, modern alternative to the more elaborate forms that had dominated the 40s. It sat forward on the crown, required a hat pin to secure it to the hair beneath. The hat pin, a long decorated metal spike, was itself a small artifact of the era, sold in sets and stored in long glass tubes on the vanity, and presented the face without concealing it, which made it appropriate for occasions where recognition and identification were social necessities. The wide-brimmed picture hat, a form with roots in the Edwardian and 20s garden party aesthetic, appeared in the 1950s in reinterpreted versions appropriate for summer occasions and church, its brim providing both the theatrical visual emphasis and the practical sun protection that the era's preoccupation with complexion management endorsed. The matching of hat to costume was a discipline with its own rules, and the breaking of those rules was immediately visible to the practiced eye. a hat that matched the dress too precisely. The same fabric, the same colour, the exact same trim, was considered overmatched, insufficiently sophisticated, the visual equivalent of a complete sentence in which every word was a synonym for the others. The correct relationship was one of coordination. The hat spoke to the dress in the same tonal language, perhaps sharing one colour or one material element, but brought its own statement rather than merely repeating the dress's. This principle extended to the full ensemble, the gloves in coordination with the hat, the shoes and handbag in their own coordination, the whole assemblage building a coherent statement through its parts without allowing any single element to dominate at the expense of the others. The handbag of the 1950s was as rigidly seasonal as the hat, and the transition of handbag at the change of seasons was itself a small annual ritual of wardrobe management. White and pale-coloured handbags, ostrich, calf, patent leather in cream, appeared at Easter and were appropriate through the summer months. Dark bags, black calf, brown leather, the darker patent colours, returned at Labour Day and were maintained through the winter. The crossing of this boundary, the carrying of a white bag after Labour Day, the bringing out of a dark bag in midsummer, was a social error visible to the most casually observant member of the social world in which the error was committed, and it was classified, in the implicit social error taxonomy of the era, as a failure of attention that communicated either carelessness or ignorance of the rules, neither of which reflected well on the carrier. The economic dimension of maintaining the full complement of seasonal and occasion-appropriate accessories was substantial, and it is worth pausing to consider how the vast majority of American women in the 1950s navigated the gap between the full wardrobe ideal and the economic reality of their households. The solution was combination and versatility. The neutral handbag that could carry across more than one colour family, the gloves that were neither too formal nor too casual for the range of occasions one actually attended, the single good hat that was selected to work with the majority of one's wardrobe rather than the ideal individual hat for each outfit. These compromises were made with the practical intelligence that was itself a kind of skill, and the woman who managed them successfully, who appeared appropriately dressed on a limited budget by making the right choices about which elements of the complete ideal were most important to invest in, was recognized and respected for this management in the same communities that theoretically demanded the complete ideal. On the 14th of February 1952, Charles Revson, the founder of Revlon, a man of volcanic commercial intelligence who had built a small nail enamel company into the dominant cosmetic brand in the United States through a combination of advertising genius and an almost supernaturally precise understanding of female psychology, launched a lipstick called Fire and Ice, with an advertising campaign that has since been recognized as one of the most brilliant pieces of cosmetic marketing ever produced. The advertisement featured the model Dorian Lee in a silver sequined gown and red velvet cape, her lips in the exact shade of the new lipstick, her eyes directed at the viewer with a mixture of challenge and invitation that had never quite been achieved in a beauty advertisement before. The accompanying copy asked, in a series of questions, whether the reader was a woman who could wear fire and ice. Have you ever danced with your shoes off? Have you ever been kissed by someone you've just met? The questions were designed to be answered yes by anyone who was honest and adventurous and possessed of any vitality, and to thereby position the purchase of a lipstick as a declaration of these qualities. The campaign sold more lipstick in the weeks following its debut than any previous Revlon product had sold in a comparable period. This was not a surprise to anyone who understood what red lipstick had been for the previous 10 years. The Second World War had established in the colour red as applied to the lips a meaning that was at once patriotic and romantic and defiant, and the post-war period had not so much inherited that meaning as deepened it. During the war, the major cosmetic manufacturers had actively participated in the national morale effort. Elizabeth Arden had produced a lipstick called Montezuma Red, specifically matched to the red thread in the United States Marine Corps uniform, and the War Production Board, which had rationed virtually every other consumer material from aluminum to rubber, had explicitly excluded cosmetics from wartime restriction on the grounds that they were essential to morale on both the home front and in the factories where women were performing the industrial labour of the war. The decision was cynical and brilliant simultaneously. It acknowledged that the cosmetic ritual had a genuine psychological function in the lives of the women who performed it, and it allowed the cosmetic industry to continue and even expand production during years when most civilian manufacturing was curtailed. The post-war lipstick was the heir to this wartime meaning. A woman who applied red lipstick in 1952 was not merely selecting a cosmetic colour, she was invoking an aesthetic language that carried, in its molecules of pigment and wax, the memory of wartime solidarity. The image of women who had kept their lips painted while doing the work of men, who had understood intuitively that the maintenance of personal beauty standards during collective crisis was a form of resistance to the crisis rather than a retreat from it. This meaning was not articulated in the advertising copy of the era, which preferred the vocabulary of romance and glamour to the vocabulary of resilience. But it was there, legible to any woman who'd been formed by the war years, as a subtext beneath the official script. The technology of the 1950s lipstick was itself a significant achievement. The formulation of lipstick, a combination of waxes, oils, and pigments, processed to produce a smooth, stable, easily applicable product that would adhere to the lips with reasonable longevity and deposit colour with acceptable opacity, had been the subject of continuous research and refinement since the commercial lipstick had emerged as a mass-market product in the early 1920s. Hazel Bishop, a chemist who had worked on aviation lubricants during the war, applied her knowledge of film formation and surface chemistry to the problem of lipstick longevity, and in 1950 introduced the first commercially successful indelible lipstick, a product she marketed under her own name as No Smear, and that achieved the aspiration of staying on the lips through eating and drinking and conversation with a fidelity that previous formulations had not managed. The Hazel Bishop product was an enormous commercial success, and forced Revlon, whose market position Hazel Bishop threatened directly, to accelerate its own indelible formulation program. The rivalry between Bishop and Revson produced, in the early 1950s, a period of extraordinary product innovation in the lipstick category, during which both companies introduced new formulations, new shades, and new advertising approaches with a frequency that kept the beauty pages of women's magazines continuously supplied with new developments to cover. Revlon's shade development program was particularly aggressive. Revson understood that the purchase of a new lipstick shade was an impulse purchase driven by novelty and aspiration rather than need, and that a woman who owned 6 Revlon lipsticks could be sold a 7th if the new shade was positioned as capturing something the previous 6 had not. The shade names were critical: Persian Melon, Bachelor's Carnation, Love That Red, Cherries in the Snow, each name a small narrative that positioned the shade as more than a colour, as an experience or a state of being that could be acquired for the price of the lipstick. The Tangy Company occupied a different and somewhat older position in the lipstick market of the 1950s. Tangi's famous natural lipstick, whose most distinctive property was its apparent transparency. The product appeared as a bright orange in the tube, but was said to respond to the individual chemistry of each woman's lips by shifting to a personalized rose or coral shade on contact with the skin, had been the dominant entry-level lipstick on the American market since the 1930s. The technology was real, based on the chemical property of certain dye compounds to shift colour in response to the pH of the skin's surface, and Tangi's advertising had built an enormous franchise around the mystique of this property. By the early 1950s, however, the red lipstick had so thoroughly dominated the cultural imagination of what a lipstick was supposed to do. It was supposed to be red, unapologetically, visibly, declaratively red. That Tangi's natural approach seemed to many consumers like hedging, like a refusal to commit to the full statement the era demanded. And it was a statement. This is the sociological fact about the red lipstick of the 1950s that distinguished it from the red lipstick of earlier or later periods. It was understood by both its wearers and observers to be a declaration rather than a decoration. A woman who put on a true, saturated, blue-based red in the morning before leaving the house was not merely selecting a cosmetic colour that she found attractive. She was announcing her participation in a particular vision of femininity that was simultaneously traditional. The red lip was the oldest beauty intensification in the Western tradition, and politically charged in the specific context of a decade that was, beneath its surface of domestic contentment, carrying enormous tensions about what women were, what they were for, and what they were permitted to want for themselves. The care and maintenance of the red lip required its own professional level skill. The application of a saturated red lipstick was more demanding than the application of a more forgiving shade, because the high pigment concentration of the red product made every error visible. The lip liner, a harder pencil formulation in a colour matched or slightly darker than the lipstick, was applied first, tracing precisely the outer edge of the lip. The classic technique for the 1950s lip was to slightly overdraw the upper lip's bow, extending the cupid's peak slightly beyond the natural vermilion border to emphasize the lip's dimensional quality in a decade that admired the full, clearly defined mouth. The lipstick itself was applied with a brush for maximum precision, blotted once on tissue, a second coat applied and blotted again, and the final result checked in a compact mirror for symmetry and edge quality before the compact was closed and returned to the handbag. The red lipstick functioned as armour in the sociological sense, most precisely articulated by the women who wore it through the decade's working and social life. It was the element of their public presentation that they most controlled, most intentionally selected, and most consistently attributed with a transformative quality. The testimony appears again and again in the oral histories and magazine interviews of the era, that the application of the red lipstick was the moment in the morning's preparation when the private woman became the public one, when the face that was assembled in the mirror resolved into the face that was presented to the world. The lipstick was the period at the end of the sentence. It completed the argument the rest of the face was making. What the red lipstick argument was ultimately was not romantic, not sexual, not even primarily decorative. It was an insistence on presence. The woman in the red lipstick was not easy to overlook. She had done something definitive and visible to her own face, and had presented that face to the world's inspection, with a confidence that was both genuine and performed. Because in the 1950s, as in every other era, the line between genuine confidence and its performance was never as clear as either the confident woman or the anxious one believed. The armour was real because it worked. It changed how the wearer moved through the world and how the world received her. Whether it changed anything more fundamental, whether the protection it offered was genuine or merely cosmetic in every sense of that word, is a question the decade did not ask, and that we are still in the process of answering. The relationship between red lipstick and professional authority in the 1950s was complicated by the decade's general ambivalence about female professional presence, an ambivalence that the lipstick made visible in an interesting way. In some professional contexts, the secretarial pool, the retail floor, the nursing station, the red lipstick was not merely permitted but expected as part of the groomed professional presentation that women were required to maintain. In other professional contexts, the courtroom, the boardroom, the academic lecture hall, the saturated red was sometimes understood as too decorative, too assertive of a particular kind of femininity that was felt to be in tension with the professional authority the setting required, and the women who navigated these environments learned to calibrate the lipstick shade with the same precision they applied to the rest of their professional presentation. This calibration was itself a form of professional intelligence, and the women who performed it most adeptly were recognized by their peers as understanding something subtle about the communication of authority and the relationship between personal aesthetics and professional credibility. The shift from a deep red to a coral to a berry represented real shifts in the social message being sent, and the woman who understood this vocabulary and deployed it intentionally was exercising a form of situational intelligence that her male colleagues, who wore essentially the same blue suit to every professional occasion, were not required to develop. That this additional layer of semiotic management was required of women while being invisible to the men around them is one of the period's characteristic asymmetries. The geography of lipstick application across the social classes of the 1950s reveals the extent to which the red lip had transcended its origins as a luxury product and become a democratic beauty practice. The department store offered Elizabeth Arden's cyclamen at several dollars per tube to the woman who could afford it. The drugstore offered Revlon at a fraction of that price. The dime store offered yet more modest options. The formula differences were real. The pigment quality, the texture, the longevity of the more expensive products genuinely surpassed the entry-level formulations. But the underlying gesture, the choice to wear red, was common across the entire spectrum. A factory worker in Youngstown and a society matron in Grosse Pointe were making the same fundamental aesthetic decision when they reached for the red, even if they reached for it in very different forms and for significantly different prices. The transition from wartime red to peacetime red had involved a subtle but real shift in the emotional register of the colour's meaning. The wartime red had carried something fierce in it, a quality of the clenched jaw and the determined spirit, the colour of keeping one's appearance maintained in the face of genuine difficulty and loss. The peacetime red was softer in its emotional register, still confident, still declarative, but now organised around celebration rather than endurance, around the pleasures of a prosperity that had been deferred for years and was now emphatically present. The lipstick companies understood this shift and adapted their advertising accordingly. Where the wartime campaigns had emphasized the red lip as fortitude, the post-war campaigns emphasized it as femininity and romance, as the color of a world returned to its proper gender order, which the advertising assumed meant women in their domestic glory and men restored to their provider function. The specific blue-based reds that dominated the most prestigious lipstick offerings of the decade, the reds that leaned toward the cool end of the spectrum that had a slight bluing of the pigment rather than the warm orange tilt of the coral reds, photograph with a particular luminosity in the black and white photography of the era that contributed to their perceived glamour. Revlon's Certainly Red, one of the decade's best-selling shades, was a true blue red whose cool precision read in photographs as a depth of colour that warmer shades did not achieve. The photography of the era was, as we've noted in the context of the studio face, a technology that transformed colour into graphic quality, and the blue-red had a graphic intensity that the advertising imagery of the decade reproduced to extraordinary effect. What remains of the red lipstick of the 1950s is not merely the continued commercial success of the colour. Red is perpetually among the best-selling lipstick shades in every decade, but something more specific and more interesting, the persistence of the meaning it carried. The woman who reaches for a saturated red in the 21st century is, whether she knows it explicitly or not, invoking a lineage of meaning that runs directly through the 1950s and the wartime and the Edwardian, and further back still, to the oldest human understanding of the adorned face as a declaration of presence. The armour is the same armour. The battle, if we're being fully honest with ourselves, is not entirely different.